Margaret's chest tightened with a weight she had never felt before. Every breath felt like a blade pressing down on her lungs as she quietly pressed herself against the wall, peeking through the slightly open living room door. There, in the middle of the room that had once been her sanctuary, her daughter Vivienne was leaning toward Asher, the younger brother of her husband, and Margaret's heart seemed to stop in disbelief. Vivienne's eyes glimmered with a mix of mischief and something darker, something Margaret could not name, but felt in every fiber of her being. The laughter of Derek, completely unaware, filled the room, and it felt like salt being rubbed into Margaret's open wounds. Derek's innocent trust, his love, his total oblivion to the poison brewing right in front of him, made Margaret's chest tighten even more. Memories of raising Vivienne, from her first steps to her first heartbreaks, flashed in her mind like cruel reminders of how fragile the world she had built really was. Every image now twisted, every cherished memory now laced with the shadow of betrayal. The walls, once warm and comforting, seemed to close in on her, turning the familiar living room into a cage of horror. She could feel the faint vibration of her daughter's movement, the almost imperceptible brush of Vivienne's hand as she neared Asher, and Margaret's stomach dropped, her knees weak with the realization that nothing could prepare her for what was happening. She wanted to shout, to intervene, to tear through the air and stop time itself, but her body froze, paralyzed by the combination of fear, grief, and disbelief. And as she stood there, every second stretching like an eternity, Margaret understood with crushing clarity that her family's life, as she knew it was fracturing in that very instant, irreversibly. Vivienne moved with a confidence that seemed to mock Margaret from the other side of the room. She laughed softly at Derek's innocent jokes, her smile warm, inviting, perfectly normal on the surface. But every so often, her eyes flicked toward Asher with a spark that screamed of betrayal. Margaret could feel it in her bones, the way Vivienne's body leaned slightly, the subtle shift in posture, the almost imperceptible tilt of her head toward Asher that told Margaret all she needed to know. Derek, oblivious, continued to talk, gesturing with his hands, his voice filled with love and trust, and Margaret's heart sank even deeper. She tried to focus on Derek, tried to anchor herself to the reality that maybe she was seeing things too darkly. But no. Every glance, every movement confirmed the horrifying truth. Her thoughts became a chaotic storm. Why? Why Vivienne? Why now? How could she risk everything for this? She imagined the countless nights she had stayed awake, worrying about her daughter's future, about love and morality, about happiness. And now all those concerns seemed both prophetic and useless. Margaret's hands trembled, her fingertips pressed against the wall, leaving faint white marks as she clutched the edge to steady herself. She wanted to scream, to warn Derek, to explode into the room and stop the inevitable. But her voice was trapped, caught in a throat constricted by fear and grief. The room seemed to pulse around her, the sunlight fatting through the curtains, turning the walls into strange, long shadows, highlighting the impossible choices and the impending catastrophe change their lives forever. Asher's presence was magnetic and terrifying in equal measure. Every step he took toward Vivienne carried a weight of inevitability, a sense that he knew exactly what he was doing, and that no moral consequence could touch him. He was charming, confident, aware of the destructive power of his own gaze and movements. Margaret's heart raced with every motion he made, as if her body were reacting to a physical blow rather than a social or moral one. She could feel the tension in the air, the electric charge of forbidden desire that Vivienne reciprocated in subtle, yet undeniable ways. Margaret's mind raced backward and forward simultaneously, recalling moments when Vivienne had spoken about attraction, friendship, fleeting interests, and now realizing that none of those things had been innocent. She tried to calculate, to understand, to rationalize, but every attempt crumbled in the face of the raw emotional assault of betrayal she was witnessing. Derek's laughter, once a comforting melody in her home, now sounded grotesque and hollow, a cruel contrast to the devastation unfolding before her eyes. The way Asher leaned slightly, tilted his head, and allowed his hand to brush near Vivienne's created a tension that was almost unbearable, a silent yet deafening signal of the collision of lust, love, and destruction. Margaret's fingers dug into the wall, nails biting into the plaster as her stomach twisted, a mixture of anger, nausea, and heartbreak consuming her. She was helpless, paralyzed by her inability to protect her daughter from herself, or to warn Derek before the moment of catastrophe struck. Every second stretched infinitely, magnifying every small gesture into monumental significance, as if time itself were conspiring to torture her with the slow unraveling of her family's bonds. Derek remained entirely oblivious, lost in a bubble of love and trust that Margaret knew would not survive the night. Every smile he cast at Vivienne, every casual touch of the hand, every look filled with affection, was a dagger to Margaret's psyche, because she knew what Vivienne's eyes and movements had already promised to someone else. The room, bathed in the soft, late afternoon sunlight, seemed almost cruelly beautiful, a stark contrast to the moral and emotional collapse happening in the same space. Margaret's mind spun with recollections of birthdays, quiet mornings, laughter echoing through the halls, and whispered secrets shared in confidence. All of it, she realized, was about to be tainted irrevocably, reinterpreted forever through the lens of betrayal. Her chest tightened painfully, a constant ache as she tried to make sense of the magnitude of what was happening. She imagined confronting Vivienne, scolding, punishing, or perhaps sobbing in despair. Yet every scenario felt inadequate. The motherly instinct to protect her child collided violently with the knowledge that Vivienne was willingly endangering everyone she loved. Margaret could almost hear the ticking of a clock, every second a hammering reminder that time was slipping away, and the consequences of inaction were mounting exponentially. She felt the familiar warmth of tears on her cheeks, the tightness of her jaw, and the trembling in her hands as she silently prayed, begged, and cursed, all at once. Vivienne's movement toward Asher was deliberate, calculated, yet cloaked in the guise of casual charm. Her fingers brushed his in a moment so fleeting, so seemingly insignificant, yet the electric charge it carried made Margaret's chest constrict with panic. Margaret wanted to collapse, scream, run, anything to prevent the inevitable fallout, but her body refused to cooperate. She realized with a sinking heart that Vivienne had already made her choice, and that Derek's naive trust and innocence had become the most dangerous weapons against him. The moral and emotional devastation that was about to be unleashed threatened to annihilate everything Margaret had built, every principle she had instilled, and every hope she had nurtured for the happiness of her daughter and her family. She envisioned the conversations, the confrontations, the shouting, the crying, the betrayal made visible, and a wave of nausea and fear swept through her. Every detail, Asher's smirk, Vivienne's sly smile, Derek's unknowing eyes, the late sunlight streaming through the blinds, the soft hum of the air conditioner, conspired to create a perfect storm of suspense, dread, and emotional collapse. Margaret understood with a painful clarity that there would be no going back after this night, no innocence left intact, no possibility of pretending everything was normal again. The room seemed to shrink around her. Time slowed to an unbearable crawl, and she knew, deep in her soul, that the family she loved was about to fracture forever. The room seemed to pulse with tension, each second stretching like a lifetime. Margaret could feel her heartbeat echoing in her ears, a relentless drum of dread and helplessness. Vivienne's laughter, soft and melodic, now carried an undertone that made Margaret's skin crawl. She noticed the subtle shift in Derek's posture, the way he leaned forward, unaware of the storm approaching. Asher's eyes held a calculating glint, a predator aware of the chaos he was weaving, and Margaret's chest tightened painfully. She thought of all the moments she had trusted her daughter to make the right choices, to uphold some sense of morality, and now that trust felt like a cruel joke. Every brush of Vivienne's fingers against Asher's hand, every tilt of her head, every glance charged with forbidden intent, sent waves of nausea and panic crashing through Margaret. She felt trapped in her own home, a prison of observation and fear, powerless to intervene before the inevitable emotional destruction would strike. The memories of Derek's devotion, his patient, gentle love, now felt like a betrayal by circumstance, an innocence about to be shattered before her eyes. Margaret's mind raced through possible interventions, each one more impossible than the last, as the ticking of the clock seemed to mock her paralysis. Margaret's thoughts spiraled uncontrollably. She imagined confronting Vivienne, screaming until her voice broke, trying to reclaim the sense of right and wrong that seemed to be slipping through her fingers. But every imagined scenario ended in failure. Vivienne's eyes, full of mischief and defiance, resisted all maternal authority. She thought about Derek, trusting, oblivious, his entire being radiating love for someone who was already betraying him in the most intimate way imaginable. The tension was suffocating, the emotional weight pressing down on Margaret's shoulders like a physical force. Asher, unaware of the full depth of Margaret's presence, continued his subtle movements toward Vivienne, a predator moving in calculated steps. Margaret felt her stomach twist in knots, bile rising as she realized that the lines between innocence, desire, and destruction had all but vanished. The sunlight streaming through the blinds seemed almost cruel, casting long shadows that mirrored the moral darkness engulfing the room. Margaret's tears threatened to spill over, each one a physical manifestation of her helplessness and grief, her mind replaying every warning she had ignored, every lesson she had tried to teach, every hope she had pinned on her daughter's integrity. She knew this moment would mark the beginning of irreversible consequences, a fracture that could never be mended. Asher leaned closer, whispering something to Vivienne that Margaret couldn't hear, but could feel the power, the intention, the danger behind his words. Vivienne's reaction, a small, almost imperceptible nod, confirmed Margaret's worst fears. The betrayal was no longer a possibility. It was a reality unfolding right before her eyes. Derek laughed again, completely unaware, and Margaret's heart broke with every sound of joy that contrasted so violently with the moral disaster in front of her. She felt a burning mixture of anger, fear, and sorrow, a cocktail of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Margaret's mind raced back to every family dinner, every conversation, every piece of guidance she had offered Vivienne, only to see it now twisted into a path leading directly to emotional ruin. She tried to anchor herself to breathe, to find some small semblance of control, but the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in with the weight of the impending catastrophe. Each small gesture, Vivienne brushing her hair, the tilt of Asher's shoulder, Derek's innocent smile, became a symphony of destruction in Margaret's mind, each note striking her more painfully than the last. She realized that no action, no warning, no intervention could halt the avalanche now hurtling toward them. Margaret's sense of time dissolved. Minutes stretched into hours, each one filled with a suffocating intensity that left her trembling. She could feel her entire body reacting physically to the emotional chaos around her. Heart racing, palms sweating, muscles tensing. Derek's trust, so pure, was now a weapon against him, and Margaret's maternal instincts screamed in vain to protect him. Asher's confidence, the almost casual arrogance with which he navigated the room, seemed to mock Margaret's helplessness. Vivienne, caught in the swirl of her own desire and manipulation, smiled knowingly, a dangerous mix of innocence and intent that Margaret could barely comprehend. Every shadow cast by the late afternoon sun seemed to exaggerate the moral darkness, elongating figures, twisting familiar surroundings into a theater of betrayal. Margaret thought of how every relationship she had nurtured, every word of advice, every lesson on loyalty and love, had been eclipsed by this one devastating moment. She wanted to step forward, to act, to reclaim some semblance of order, but her body refused. She could only stand, paralyzed, as witness to the slow unraveling of everything she had once held sacred. And then it happened, the first unmistakable touch, the one that sealed the irreversible path. Vivienne's fingers grazed Asher's hand, deliberate, measured, charged with intent, and Margaret's entire body stiffened. The room seemed to shudder with the weight of betrayal. Every sound amplified: the creak of the floorboard, the whisper of fabric, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Derek's laughter, still oblivious, was now unbearable, a stark contrast to the chaos that filled Margaret's mind. She saw the expression in Asher's eyes, the thrill, the satisfaction, the power, and it made her want to vomit and scream simultaneously. Tears ran freely down Margaret's cheeks, her hands covering her face in an instinctive attempt to shield herself from the emotional onslaught. She realized that this night would forever change the trajectory of all their lives: Vivienne, Asher, Derek, and herself. Nothing would ever be the same. Every dream of family harmony, every memory of love and trust, every shred of moral certainty had been ripped away, leaving only the raw, unfiltered consequences of choices made and desires pursued. Margaret knew, with a clarity that was almost unbearable, that the emotional earthquake she was witnessing would resonate for years, and perhaps decades, leaving scars that no apology, no reconciliation could ever heal. Margaret could hardly breathe. Every subtle movement in the room now felt magnified, echoing in her chest like thunder. Vivienne laughed softly, a sound that once would have been innocent and sweet, but now it carried the weight of deception and danger. Derek still sat, oblivious, unaware that the woman he loved was inching closer to betrayal with every heartbeat. Margaret's eyes followed Vivienne as she leaned slightly toward Asher, the tip of her fingers brushing his arm in a calculated gesture, sending ripples of tension through the entire room. The late afternoon sun cast long, menacing shadows across the carpet, turning familiar furniture into ominous shapes. Margaret's mind raced, remembering every word she had taught her daughter about trust, fidelity, and responsibility, all now shredded in this one moment. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she tried to anchor herself, to find some grounding in the chaos. But the weight of inevitability pressed down harder with every second. Each glance from Asher, each subtle motion, each knowingly dangerous smile from Vivienne twisted Margaret's insides into knots. She understood with crushing clarity that this was the culmination of desires, mistakes, and human frailty, all colliding in an emotional explosion that would destroy the fragile threads of trust holding their lives together. Asher's presence was suffocatingly dominant, a magnetic pull that seemed to bend the room around him. Margaret felt as if she were underwater, every sound distorted, every movement slowed, every heartbeat echoing painfully in her ears. She tried to focus on Derek, to remind herself of his love and innocence, but the contrast between his unknowing joy and the looming betrayal was almost unbearable. Vivienne's eyes, sparkling with calculated mischief, flicked toward Asher repeatedly, and Margaret could see the way Derek's laughter and casual gestures now collided violently with the reality she could not stop. Every second seemed to stretch into eternity, filled with electric tension, moral conflict, and raw human desire. Margaret wanted to act, to intervene physically, but the paralysis of horror held her captive. The sunlight, now filtering through the blinds at a sharper angle, painted patterns on the floor that seemed almost like a cruel commentary on the chaos. Lines converging, colliding, fracturing, mirroring the moral implosion she was witnessing. Margaret's body shook, her stomach churned, and tears streamed freely down her cheeks as she realized the devastating truth. This moment would haunt them all forever. Vivienne leaned closer, her voice a whisper only Asher could hear, carrying promises and implications that would fracture lives. Margaret could not hear the words, but she could feel them vibrating through the space between them, a silent transmission of betrayal. Derek's attention remained blissfully elsewhere, a stark contrast that heightened Margaret's panic. She imagined the conversations that would follow, the confrontation, the crying, the accusations, the shattering of illusions. Every single fiber of her being ached with the knowledge that her daughter had knowingly crossed moral boundaries, choosing desire over loyalty, passion over love. Margaret could feel a storm building inside her, a mix of fury, despair, and grief that threatened to consume her entirely. She pressed her back harder against the wall, wanting to disappear, to escape the room that had become a theater of destruction. Her mind replayed every past conversation with Vivienne, every lesson about honesty and respect, and the bitter irony of those memories left her raw and vulnerable. The air seemed to thicken, each breath heavier than the last, as Margaret realized the moment of moral collapse had already arrived, unstoppable and devastating in its clarity. Asher's calculated movements and Vivienne's responsive gestures created a tension so thick it was almost tangible. Margaret felt it pressing against her skin, squeezing her chest, making her knees weak. She thought about Derek, sitting there, unaware, trusting, his love being weaponized against him by the very people he cared for most. Margaret's mind raced backward and forward, trying to dissect what had led them here, trying to find a cause, a warning, a justification, but none existed. Everything was raw, immediate, and devastating. The moral collapse, the emotional implosion, was complete, and Margaret was helpless, a spectator to the unraveling of everything she had tried to protect. The room itself seemed to conspire, with long shadows stretching like tendrils, light bending, and reflecting off surfaces in unnatural ways, emphasizing the grotesque beauty of betrayal. Margaret's fingers clawed at the wall, nails scraping into plaster, grounding herself against the overwhelming horror. Every heartbeat was a drum, every breath a reminder of her helplessness. She felt the future slipping through her fingers, the life she had built for her daughter, and family fracturing into irreparable pieces. Then came the first unmistakable contact, the touch that signified the irreversible crossing of lines. Vivienne's hand grazed Asher's in a deliberate, intimate gesture, and Margaret felt as though the room itself contracted around her. Every sound, the faint creak of the floor, the rustle of fabric, Derek's oblivious laughter, was amplified, echoing like a verdict in her skull. Her chest tightened painfully, tears streaming uncontrollably as she tried to make sense of the magnitude of what had just occurred. The moral landscape of her home had shifted irrevocably. Trust, love, and innocence lay in ruins. Margaret's mind raced, envisioning Derek discovering the truth, the confrontations, the arguments, the heart-wrenching revelations. The emotional storm was only beginning, and she could already feel the aftershocks cascading forward. Shattered hearts, broken bonds, a family forever altered. Every minute detail, the tilt of Vivienne's head, Asher's confident smirk, the fatting light, the humming appliances, combined into a sensory symphony of betrayal, intensifying Margaret's agony. She understood with a bone-deep certainty that nothing could undo this moment, that it would ripple across all their lives like an unstoppable tidal wave, leaving devastation in its wake.
If this story hits you, you can support the channel with a quick hype.
The house felt like it was closing in on Margaret, every corner a witness to the betrayal she could not stop. Vivienne's laughter, now sharper, almost predatory, echoed off the walls, sending shivers down her spine. Derek remained blissfully unaware, his trust and love for Vivienne radiating through every gesture, every word, every smile. Asher's presence loomed over the space like a shadow, a silent predator aware of the chaos he had unleashed. Margaret's hands gripped the edge of the hallway, knuckles white, her body shaking as adrenaline coursed through her veins. Memories of her daughter's childhood, her first steps, the bedtime stories, the whispered confidences, they now felt like cruel reminders of what was being destroyed. Every inch of Margaret's being screamed to intervene, to scream, to stop the moral disintegration. But her body refused to cooperate. She was frozen, caught between maternal instinct and the horrifying inevitability of what was happening. Every subtle glance, every brush of hands, every slight movement carried an explosive tension. Each moment, a knife twisting deeper into her chest. The air itself seemed charged with electricity, thick and suffocating, amplifying the moral collapse that was unfolding in slow, merciless detail. Margaret's mind raced uncontrollably, bouncing between scenarios, memories, and pure panic. She could see Derek's innocent happiness, a fragile bubble that would soon be shattered, yet she felt powerless to act. Vivienne and Asher moved with a silent synchronization that made every nerve in Margaret's body scream. The sound of laughter, soft whispers, and shared glances became deafening, each one a reminder of the trust being annihilated in front of her. Margaret remembered her warnings to Vivienne, the lessons on love, fidelity, and respect, each now rendered meaningless. Her stomach twisted painfully, bile rising as she realized that this night would forever alter every aspect of their lives. Every shadow cast by the setting sun seemed exaggerated, darkening the corners of the room, highlighting the moral darkness seeping into their once safe home. Margaret felt like an intruder in her own life, a a silent observer to the slow-burning emotional apocalypse unfolding before her eyes. Every breath she took was sharp, painful, and trembling with the knowledge that nothing could stop what had begun. Asher's subtle touches became bolder, each one calculated to provoke, entice, and dominate. Margaret's eyes followed every gesture, heart hammering painfully in her chest, stomach knotting with revulsion and fear. Vivienne's responses were equally deliberate, teasing, and dangerously aware of the consequences, yet unmoved by them. Derek's continued ignorance, his laughter, his gentle glances, made Margaret's sense of injustice grow unbearable. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of movement became a dagger in her mind. The moral implosion of her household was now in full view, unavoidable, relentless, and Margaret could only tremble in silent agony. She remembered all the moments that had built the foundation of their family: birthdays, morning coffees, late-night talks. And now all of them were twisted, corrupted by desire, betrayal, and manipulation. She knew with terrifying certainty that the coming confrontation would shatter lives, hearts, and trust beyond repair. Every second of observation increased the weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating, relentless, as she braced for the emotional explosion that she knew was inevitable. The first confrontation erupted without warning, a burst of emotion that shattered the fragile veneer of normalcy. Derek's eyes widened as he finally noticed the tension, the secret gestures, the betrayal woven into the fabric of his home. Vivienne's face betrayed nothing, yet screamed everything in her subtle glances, while Asher's smug expression confirmed every suspicion. Margaret's heart felt as if it had been ripped from her chest, each beat a hammer of anguish and despair. The room became a battlefield of raw emotion. Anger, sorrow, shame, guilt, and betrayal collided in a cacophony that reverberated through every corner. Derek's voice cracked as he demanded answers. Vivienne's deflection only fueled his pain, and Asher's calm, calculated demeanor added insult to injury. Margaret could barely breathe, tears blinding her vision, stomach twisting in knots as the emotional hurricane tore through the household. Every gesture, every word, every accusation built the tension to a peak of unbearable intensity. Each character's flaws, desires, and regrets laid bare in an explosive emotional spectacle. The once safe home had become a theater of devastation, and Margaret's role as a silent witness now felt impossible to bear. And then the collapse. Derek turned away, the betrayal too much to bear, his voice a whisper of devastation. Vivienne's calculated mask began to crack, revealing the fear and guilt beneath, while Asher's confidence faltered in the face of the emotional tsunami he had helped unleash. Margaret's tears flowed freely, an uncontrollable torrent, as she witnessed the full scale of the moral and emotional destruction. The family's bonds, carefully nurtured for decades, now lay in ruins. Every choice, every desire, every betrayal, every secret converged into a moment of absolute, unrelenting pain. Margaret felt as if her entire being had been shattered, her identity as a mother and protector stripped away in the merciless light of truth. The room seemed to vibrate with grief, despair, and the echo of irreversible choices. Time slowed, each second stretching into an eternity, and Margaret knew that nothing would ever be the same. Every glance, every memory, every sense of security had been destroyed, leaving only raw, aching emptiness. The emotional quake would reverberate through their lives for years to come, leaving scars that no apology, no reconciliation could ever heal. The night closed in like a shroud, and Margaret, trembling, exhausted, and broken, realized with a bone-deep certainty that the lives of all four, the daughter, her lover, her husband, and herself, would never recover from the devastation she had just witnessed. Margaret could feel the weight of silence pressing down on her after the emotional storm of the previous confrontation. Each room in the house seemed tainted, every familiar object now a reminder of betrayal. Derek had retreated to the bedroom, his body slumped, face buried in his hands, and Margaret's heart ached with the unbearable sight. Vivienne paced the living room, her head lowered, as if she were rehearsing the lies and justifications she would need to survive the fallout. Asher sat silently, his usual arrogance replaced by a subtle unease, aware that the chaos had consequences even he couldn't fully control. Margaret's mind wandered through every memory she had of her daughter, the bedtime stories, the laughter echoing through the halls, the unspoken moments of trust that had built a fragile bridge between mother and child. Now that bridge was gone, reduced to splinters. Every breath felt heavy, almost tangible, pressing against her chest like a physical weight. She thought of Derek's suffering, the depth of his heartbreak, and the helplessness tore at her soul. Each subtle gesture, Vivienne's hand brushing against the sofa, Asher's fidgeting, Derek's shivering exhale, was amplified in Margaret's mind into a symphony of regret, despair, and moral collapse. The emotional landscape of her home had become a battlefield, and Margaret stood in the eye of the storm, paralyzed by grief and the enormity of what had transpired. Margaret's thoughts spiraled uncontrollably as she attempted to piece together the wreckage of the evening. How had it come to this? Every choice, every neglected warning, every ignored sign seemed to converge into this unrelenting nightmare. She thought of Derek's devotion, the unwavering love he had offered Vivienne, now violated in the most intimate, visceral way imaginable. Margaret could feel her chest tighten with each heartbeat, her palms slick with sweat, her legs trembling. Asher, now fully aware of the extent of the damage, remained still, a predator in a cage, knowing that even he could not escape the consequences. Vivienne's emotions were a storm of defiance, guilt, and something darker, arrogance mixed with thrill, a volatile combination that threatened to ignite further destruction. Margaret's mind raced through possible interventions, apologies, conversations, any action that could reverse the moral collapse she had just witnessed. But each one dissolved into impossibility Every glance at the destroyed expressions on their faces sent waves of nausea and despair coursing through her. She felt the gravity of the moment, not only in her mind, but in every cell of her body. The air thick with the scent of fear, betrayal, and the raw intensity of human desire clashing with consequence. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Margaret watched Vivienne approach Derek, her movements deliberate, almost hypnotic. Derek looked up, eyes swollen, tears threatening to spill, and the innocence in his gaze was now marred by betrayal. Margaret's stomach twisted painfully, bile rising as the implications of each subtle gesture became painfully clear. Asher followed with a careful, calculating glance, his presence a constant reminder of the dangerous power dynamics at play. Margaret felt trapped in a nightmare where every sensory input, the creak of the floorboards, the subtle rustle of clothing, the sharp inhale of breath, magnified the unbearable tension. Memories of her daughter as a child, her trust in every small decision, every shared secret, every moment of bonding, now turned into shards of guilt and regret that cut deeper with every passing second. She understood with bone-deep clarity that this night would define lives forever, a point of no return where innocence, love, and trust had all been destroyed. Every subtle facial expression, every trembling hand, every hint of desperation became a landscape of emotional devastation in Margaret's eyes. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a theater of moral collapse, each room echoing with the consequences of choices driven by desire, selfishness, and impulsive rebellion. Margaret's grief transformed into something heavier, something nearly tangible, pressing against her chest with every heartbeat. Derek's sobs echoed in the living room, each one a dagger to her soul. Vivienne's defiance cracked, a momentary flicker of guilt passing across her face before it was replaced by calculated charm, an unsettling display of manipulation and survival instinct. Asher's usually calm demeanor faltered in the storm of raw emotion, his calculated steps now tinged with uncertainty and fear. Margaret felt herself trembling uncontrollably, her tears flowing freely, each one a testament to the unbearable pain of witnessing the destruction of everything she had held sacred. She thought of the future, the unrepairable rifts, the long-lasting consequences of desire and betrayal. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound amplified, every moment a painful reminder that the family she had known, the relationships she had nurtured, were now fractured beyond recognition. Margaret realized with gut-wrenching clarity that this night would haunt all of them for years, a permanent scar on the landscape of their lives. The room, filled with echoes of anger, sorrow, and devastation, became an almost living entity, amplifying the collapse and forcing every character to confront the raw consequences of their actions. The final act of devastation in the night unfolded like a slow-motion catastrophe. Derek, broken, finally turned his back, shaking with anguish and disbelief. Vivienne's carefully constructed mask of control began to crumble entirely, revealing raw fear and the faintest hint of remorse. But it was too late. Asher's smirk, once a shield of arrogance, faltered under the weight of the emotional storm he had helped create. Margaret felt her own body dissolve into tears and trembling, each moment a physical manifestation of grief, horror, and despair. The moral fabric of the household had ripped apart completely. Every relationship, every trust, every bond lay in ruins. Margaret knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever return to what it had been. The room seemed to close in, the air thick with unspoken accusations, regrets, and irreversible consequences. Every glance, every word left unsaid, every tiny gesture magnified the emotional devastation. Margaret realized that all four of their lives, the daughter, her lover, her husband, and herself, would carry these scars forever. Nothing could undo the collapse, and the weight of the destruction pressed down on Margaret with relentless force, leaving her exhausted, broken, and shivering in the aftermath of a night that would define the rest of their lives. Margaret sat in stunned silence, the remnants of the night's chaos pressing heavily on her shoulders. Every detail lingered with agonizing clarity. Derek's broken gaze, Vivienne's sly, calculated glances, Asher's uneasy stance, the echo of unspoken words reverberating like hammers in her chest. She tried to breathe, tried to process, but the weight of betrayal was relentless. Memories of her daughter's laughter as a child, the trust she had instilled, every whispered secret, every hug, every moment of innocence, all now seemed tainted, a cruel reminder of how fragile love and loyalty could be. Margaret's hands shook uncontrollably as she pressed them against her temples, trying to steady the storm raging in her mind. She imagined the long aftermath, conversations laced with anger, tears, denial, and regret. The walls of her home felt like they were closing in, the shadows stretching long and menacingly across the floor, each one a symbol of moral decay. Every subtle glance exchanged between Vivienne and Asher now felt like a fresh knife, a constant, unrelenting reminder of the irreversible choices that had brought them here. Margaret's heart raced, each beat echoing with a mixture of grief, fury, and helplessness, the emotional weight nearly unbearable. Derek retreated further, slumping into a corner, unable to comprehend the full extent of the devastation. Margaret's eyes followed him, agonizing at every slight tremor in his posture, every faltering breath, every quiet whimper that escaped his lips. She wanted to reach out, to console, to protect him from the storm, but felt immobilized by shock and the crushing reality of betrayal. Vivienne, sensing the magnitude of what had occurred, oscillated between moments of arrogance and fleeting vulnerability, creating a tension in the room that seemed almost suffocating. Asher's calculated demeanor cracked slightly, revealing the first hints of fear, uncertainty, and the dawning realization that consequences were unavoidable. Margaret's mind replayed the moments leading up to this collapse, the subtle touches, the exchanged glances, the carefully orchestrated seduction, and she shuddered at the precision with which innocence had been manipulated. The house itself seemed to resonate with despair. Every creak, every sigh, every faint sound a cruel amplification of emotional devastation. Margaret felt herself shrinking inside, trapped within a vortex of grief, guilt, and moral outrage. Each moment stretching infinitely as the night's horrors settled into permanent memory. Vivienne's movements became almost theatrical, a deliberate dance of control and provocation. Margaret could see every intention behind every tilt of the head, every flicker in her eyes, every slight curve of her lips. Asher followed with measured steps, his presence a constant reminder of the dangerous power dynamics at play. Margaret's heart pounded violently, her stomach twisting painfully as she imagined the confrontation that would inevitably follow, the breaking of bonds, the irreversible consequences. She remembered Derek's unyielding devotion, his unwavering love, and the innocence he had brought into this tangled web of desire and betrayal. Now that innocence lay in ruins, and Margaret felt as though she were carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Every sound was magnified, from the rustle of clothing to the faintest breath, each one an unbearable echo in the theater of moral collapse that had become her home. Margaret's mind and body were synchronized in a painful symphony of grief, despair, and rage. A storm that threatened to consume every fiber of her being, leaving only raw, unfiltered agony in its wake. The confrontation escalated once more, a brutal collision of emotions that tore through the room like wildfire. Derek's voice, cracking and trembling, demanded answers, demanded truth, demanded restitution for the betrayal that had been orchestrated before his eyes. Vivienne's deflection and manipulation only intensified his anguish, fueling Margaret's own pain. Asher's calm facade began to crumble under the weight of unrelenting emotional chaos, revealing the first signs of vulnerability in the midst of calculated cruelty. Margaret's tears fell freely, a torrential storm, as she watched the fabric of trust unravel, thread by thread, into irreparable chaos. Each subtle gesture, every word, every silent glance carried a magnitude of emotional devastation that seemed almost unbearable. Margaret's body shook as if in rhythm with the crumbling of her family's moral and emotional foundation. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room, bending reality into a reflection of the inner turmoil. And Margaret felt the finality of the night pressing into her very bones. Every heartbeat, every shudder, every sob of Derek amplified the unbearable weight of human frailty, desire, and consequence, leaving nothing untouched by grief and destruction. And then came the aftermath, the silent reckoning. Derek sat motionless, his eyes hollow, reflecting the wreckage of innocence lost. Vivienne's arrogance had vanished entirely, replaced by the faintest tremor of remorse and fear. Yet it was too late to change the past. Asher's calculated arrogance had crumbled, leaving him as vulnerable as anyone else in the room. Margaret felt herself disintegrating internally, each sob a physical blow, each tear a testament to the unbearable magnitude of human betrayal and consequence. The house, once a sanctuary, had transformed into a mausoleum of shattered trust, broken hearts, and moral collapse. Margaret's mind and body trembled under the weight of permanent damage. The relationships, the love, the security, the innocence, all destroyed in a single night of desire, miscalculation, and human weakness. She understood, with a bone-deep, gut-level certainty, that the lives of all four, the daughter, her husband, her lover, and herself, would carry these scars forever. Time slowed to a crawl, each second stretching into an eternity as the emotional devastation settled into permanence. Margaret, trembling, exhausted, broken, knew without doubt that nothing could repair the destruction, that the night had defined their lives in ways that would echo for years, leaving an indelible imprint of betrayal, pain, and irreversible consequences.
If you've ever felt this kind of pain, don't walk through it alone. Hit subscribe and stay with us. More real stories are coming.